My name's Daniel MacArthur-Seal. I'm the Assistant Director at the British Institute at Ankara. I'm very excited for this evening's lecture, which will be delivered by our postdoctoral research fellow, Gizem Tongo, of the last 2 years. She is a historian of art and visual culture more broadly in the late Ottoman period. And she's also, aside from being a postdoctoral research fellow at the British Institute at Ankara, more recently has been working as a part-time lecturer at the Department of Architecture in Middle East Technical University. She received her doctorate in Oriental Studies from the University of Oxford, St. John's College, where she was a Lord Dulverton Scholar and later a Barakat postdoctoral fellow. As mentioned, she mostly focuses on the cultural history of the late Ottoman Empire and is particularly interested in the relationship between war and culture during the conflict and its aftermath. She has also worked as a co-curator and consultant for exhibitions, including one on Mihri Hanım, the topic of this evening's lecture, which was held at Salt Galata in Istanbul in 2019. Discussant is Ahmet Ersoy, who's an associate professor at the history department of Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. Ersoy works on the history of the late Ottoman Empire, particularly focusing on visual culture also, and is the author of Architecture and the Late Ottoman Historical Imaginary, Reconfiguring the Architectural Past in a Modernizing Empire, published in 2015. His recent research involves the entwined histories of photography and print culture, and publications include Ottomans and the Kodak Galaxy, Archiving Everyday Life, and Historical Space in Ottoman Illustrated Journals, which was published in the journal History of Photography in September 2016. So I will now pass to Gizem, but before I do so, I'll just a few notes for the audience. The lecture is being recorded on YouTube and will be available to watch subsequently if you have to step out at any point. You can use the chat box to introduce yourselves and talk to either the panelists or the rest of the audience. You can select who you're sending your message to using the selector at the bottom of the chat box. When it comes towards the end of the lecture and you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box to ask your question rather than the chat box, as we're likely to lose track of your questions if they are just put in the chat. And then, so please use the Q&A for that. Okay, so I'll pass to Gizem now and disappear briefly. Thanks again for joining.
I hope you can hear me okay. So thank you, Daniel, for this generous introduction. It's such a pleasure to be invited to give a talk today at my academic home, the British Institute at Ankara. I also would like to take this opportunity to thank the director of the Institute, Dr. Lutgarde van de Put, and Daniel once again for giving me a platform to share my research today. I'm also thrilled to have Ahmet Ersoy, my master's supervisor at Boğaziçi University, here with me as a discussant. And on a final note, I also would like to thank Berna Gençalp, Özlem Gülün Dağoğlu, Lawrence Tanatar Baru, and Farah Aksoy for answering my endless questions while preparing this talk. I'm also delighted that this presentation gives me the opportunity to revisit our 2019 exhibition at Salt Galata, Istanbul, that we entitled Mihri, a migrant painter of modern times, and organized collaboratively together with Özlem, Lawrence, Farah, and Ahmet. So the title of my talk today is Revisiting Mihri Hanım, a woman painter in the late Ottoman Empire. I would like to start with Mihri's own voice from an interview she gave to a fellow intellectual in Istanbul. The date of the interview is 1919. Mihri is a 33-year-old woman who had already established a reputation both for her role at the Academy of Fine Arts in Istanbul and as a portrait artist of impressive dexterity. Quote. So this is Mihri talking. Portraiture is the first brush stroke of painting. Yet, however pleasing a portrait may be, it cannot, I think, be considered an artwork. Think of all the fine subjects available to us. For instance, the nighttime Teravih prayers during Ramadan, or the circumcision ceremony. Such subjects are surely both highly original and completely native. A Turkish painter should express her own soul, but to work on these subjects, I would have to be a wealthy woman. I should be able to gather the decorations and people of which I am in need. And in doing all this, I should be able to expend weeks and months. Let me create one work in a year, but let it be a vital work. Yet I am completely destitute of the means, and our way of life deprives me of many things. The other day, for instance, I saw a beautiful woman, a very beautiful woman, slender and elegantly built, with piercing eyes and slim, fairy-like little feet. But to sit that woman down to paint her by a fountain in some oriental grove is an impossible thing for me. I could neither entice that woman to sit for me, nor find such a garden. In short, you see that there is a chasm between what I have created and what I thought. Throughout my talk, I will come back to this remarkable interview. But to start my presentation, I am interested in the question of what it means to be deprived of many things for a woman painter in the late Ottoman Empire. Given Mihri's elite background and privileged upbringing, was all this talk of destitution just an exaggeration for rhetorical effect? Here, just a quick look at Mihri's work that I will be talking about. I would like to emphasize that my paper draws on feminist and revisionist approaches to art history. Since Linda Nohlin's 1971 groundbreaking and troubling question of why there had been no great woman artist, feminist art historians have transformed the study of visual culture. Nohlin's answer to her own question, however, was not to discover women artists and give them the titles of great or genius, as these concepts were, for Nohlin, were already masculine stereotypes. Following Nohlin in the 1970s, the major objectives for feminists was to recover women's hidden heritage, making the missing and marginalized women artists and their art accessible through various and valuable biographical studies. By the 1980s, feminist scholars like Griselda Pollock had begun to question the initiative of simply adding women artists to the already highly problematic existing canon and called instead for feminist interventions in the histories of art. Some scholars, including Janet Wolfe, also drew our attention to aesthetic hierarchies involved in the masculinist myths of the canon formation. Whilst post-Cubist modern art was praised for its so-called masculine qualities, figurative and realist art seen as feminine and was marginalized. Through these revisionist art historical studies, we have learned a good deal more about those hidden woman artists and the biases within the methods of art history itself. Mihri's artistic life and her leading role in women's art education in Istanbul is particularly instructive because it makes clear the often suppressed process of gender inequalities and the structural sexism within both the art world in which she functioned and the art historical discourse in which she was marginalized. Furthermore, as Mihri was laboring on the margins of the international art world as a Muslim Ottoman woman, her story, I believe, also challenges Eurocentric assumptions which seem to have reduced the general category of women's art to the work of Western women artists alone. While this paper will put Mihri at the center of accounts of artistic developments in the Istanbul art world, it will also explore the gendered politics of art production, reception, and canon formation. My questions are as follows. What social and cultural factors conditions Mihri's life and works as a woman artist? What hardships did she face in a male-dominated art world? And how did she overcome inequality, discrimination, and prejudice? And finally, what did she produce? And what were the reasons, artistic or otherwise, behind her choices of subjects and the way she painted them? Mihri was born into a prominent upper-class family in Istanbul. Her family was Ahmet Rasim Pasha, an instructor of anatomy classes at the Imperial Medical School. Ahmet Rasim Pasha's relatives were also members of the Sultan Abdülhamid's palace circles, and these imperial connections helped young Mihri's aspirations to develop her talent in painting. We know that she visited Yıldız Palace and had the opportunity to produce portraits there, but as she briefly mentions in her 1919 interview, she was not allowed to take photographs of these works. Through her palace connections, she was introduced to the Italian painter Fausto Zonara, who had been in the city since 1891. Known for his academic style and intimate images of Oriental life, Zonara also created depictions of historical events from the Ottoman past, mainly upon direct commission by Abdülhamid, such as this large oil-on canvas depicting the Ottoman-Greek War. Zonara's teaching provided Mihri with direction, but as we shall see, not so much with artistic inspiration in her style or subject matter. Probably the earliest work by Mihri is this impressive self-portrait. I will come back to Mihri's portraits later in my talk, but suffice to say that this self-portrait shows her signature pastel hatching technique, which combines the rhythmic effects of spontaneous line with her liberal energy and very much suggests a remarkable artist about to create a reputation as a portraitist. Interestingly, during the 1919 Istanbul interview, Mihri mentions no details about her art training in Europe. But in 1924, for an interview conducted with an Italian newspaper, she dwells at length on how much she had to resist her conservative environment, how interested she was in Western culture, and how she fled the Ottoman Empire as a young woman. We included this interesting interview in our South Galata exhibition, thanks to Özlem. Here, we learned that Mihri first studied at the French Academy in Rome and later at École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. I would like us to remember here that when Mihri was a young painter, there was no Academy of Fine Arts for women in Istanbul yet. As such, a more liberal artistic environment was only available to women who could afford to travel to Europe, like Mihri. It was in Paris that Mihri received an honorable mention for one of her works. In a letter I found in the Istanbul Archaeology Museum archives and dated March 1911, we can see where Mihri lived when she was in Paris. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, she chose Montparnasse, the primary center for cosmopolitan Bohemian culture. Here, I would like to thank Ethem Elden for drawing my attention to this folder at the Archaeology Museum. Mihri's first official artistic collaboration with the Ottoman Empire also began while she was still in Paris. The letters sent by the curator of the painting collection at the Louvre Museum expresses Mihri's enthusiastic wish to produce a copy of a European masterpiece for a painting museum project by Halil Ethem, the director of both the Academy of Fine Arts and the Imperial Museum. Having replaced his brother Osman Hamdi Bey after the latter's death in 1910, one of Halil Ethem's first initiatives was to request a budget to commission copies of European master paintings for a future museum project. When the budget was guaranteed, European and Ottoman artists were commissioned to produce copies of European masters in major national museums in various cities, including Paris, Rome, and Berlin. One of those artists was Mihri Hanım, who was recommended to the curator despite having no previous experience of copying. It appears that Mihri was directed by the curator in the Louvre to the Dutch Golden Age painter Frans Hals' The Gypsy Girl, that was produced in 1628. Regarded as a tronie, that's the Dutch word for face, the Gypsy Girl, like other tronie paintings, was not a commissioned portrait, but a portrait of an unknown person whose expressions or characters interested the painter. Probably the most iconic example of the tronie genre is the painting Girl with a pearl earring that we all know. I want to emphasize this incident because, the incident that she was encouraged to paint Franz Hals, because Mihri would primarily become a portraitist, and among her portraits were not only commissioned ones, but as we shall see, also portraits of ordinary people, and most especially portraits of unknown women. We can posit that producing this copy seems to have had a long-lasting influence on Mihri's art. So, back to Mihri. Mihri returns to Istanbul in 1912 and started working as an art instructor at the Teachers College in Istanbul, that's Darül Muallimat. A turning point in Mihri's career in Istanbul came in October 1914 with the groundbreaking decision to found an Academy of Fine Arts for women. The times, however, were hard for the Ottomans due to the ongoing war. Conscription meant that a good many male students of the higher education institutions had been called to the front. For instance, Arif Hikmet, who was an architect student at the Academy of Fine Arts, was drafted to the army. This is a photograph showing him on the Erzurum front. According to a news published in the daily İktam in August 1918, there were perhaps only 5 to 10 male students at work in the studios, and classrooms at the Academy of Arts for men were almost empty. Yet, as higher and art education for males was in serious wartime decline, women's education in the empire and their social role more generally was undergoing an energetic redefinition. Here, I would like to particularly emphasize that most secondary sources written on Ottoman women's experience during the First World War actually referred only to Muslim women's experience, and that the story for non-Muslims, especially for Armenian women, was certainly a different one. As elsewhere, the war very much changed Ottoman Muslim women's social roles and visibility in the Ottoman Empire, hastening their entry into professional life and public space. For the ruling Committee of Union and Progress, the position of Muslim women had propaganda value as a symbol of national civilization and was key to the ideology of its wartime modernization project. In the nationalist journal Yeni Mecma, an anonymous writer proclaimed that, quote, "If the World War had not taken place, women no doubt would have needed to wait much longer to acquire the rights they have gained." End quote. One of the major outcomes of this new relation between the state and woman was the creation of a more liberal atmosphere that allowed Ottoman women to have access to higher education and leading institutional positions. And the foundation of the Academy of Fine Arts was part and parcel of this new cultural structure. As we learn from an admittedly much later account written by Malik Aksel in 1977, the motive force behind the foundation of the Academy of Fine Arts for Women was the young and ambitious painter Mihri, who presented the idea to the Ministry of Education, Ahmet Şükrü Bey. In her talk to the ministry, Mihri Hanım raised her concerns over the inequality between women and men. Quote, "Today, equality and justice are discussed in every quarter. Yet, where is the fine arts school for women? All that has been done for men." End quote. It's not possible to be 100% sure whether Mihri really uttered these words to the Minister of Education, but in the 1924 interview published in Italy that I previously mentioned, Mihri clearly says that she was the founder of the academy. To be on the safe side, I can claim that she was instrumental in the foundation of the academy, where she became first the head teacher and then 1 year later its director. The Academy of Fine Arts for Women offered merits-based artistic education without any charge, admitting women from various socioeconomic class. The curriculum combined practical courses such as drawing classes with more theoretical ones, including artistry and human anatomy. Mihri taught art classes from the first day of the academy, but following the resignation of Ali Sami Bey in November 1915, she also became its director and served as the only one for almost a month until a much older male painter, Ömer Adil, joined her as the co-director in early November. I don't know why it was decided that Mihri had to have a senior male painter to co-direct the academy, but the wage difference that I observe in the documents is remarkable. While Mihri was being paid 2,000 kuruş, Ömer Adil could only make 800 for his managerial position. For sure, Ömer Adil had another official position at the Academy of Fine Arts for Men, hence his wage might be equal or more in total, but I cannot resist pointing out that in terms of the gender pay gap, Mihri was making more than double what Ömer Bey was at the Academy of Fine Arts for Women. In terms of the curriculum and the day-to-day educational practice of the school, as the archival documents show, the academy sometimes requested skeletons from the medical school. In another document, we learned that there were two types of studentships in the academy. The registered students, which was called müdavim, and the auditing ones was called hariç. As the third article of the official foundation document shows us, students were expected to work with plaster casts and three-dimensional objects. This term is a bit tricky to translate because in the Ottoman Turkish, the term appears as mücessem modeller, mücessem coming from the Arabic term cism, which is object. So it's therefore not clear whether these models also included live models, a practice which we know had caused serious outcry in conservative newspapers at the Men's Fine Arts Academy around 1907. Students at the academy were also encouraged to paint plein air and as the archival document shows, they often visited the gardens of Topkapı Palace to do so. Here is a photograph from our exhibition, which shows Mihri students' works produced outside. The demand for the academy among women was such that the number of students reached 190 in August 1918. Here is another photograph we displayed in our exhibition, which shows Mihri sitting on the front row at the Academy of Fine Arts for Women. Maybe I can use my row. She's here. Mihri didn't display her works to the public during that time, at least until her solo exhibition in October 1918. But her students did. Maide Esat Hanım and Müjdan Sait Hanım, for instance, displayed their paintings, including, as we learned from the exhibition catalogs, landscapes. I don't want to go into detail here about those First World War exhibitions, but I can briefly mention that a considerable number of Ottoman women artists participated in those displays. In 1916, 10 women among 50 artists in total, and in 1917, 11 women among 37 in total. This is one of the paintings displayed in 1916 exhibition, a small half-length portrait entitled simply Guitar Player, Kitaracı, by the 21-year-old Ottoman Greek painter Eleni Iliadis, who also received a medal by the exhibition jury. The visibility of women artists in the art world, however, does not mean that the usual processes of gender hierarchy were not in play, including the sexist and Orientalist language typically adopted by contemporary reviews. A contemporary American newspaper, for instance, described the participation of women artists in the 1916 Istanbul exhibition in rather condescending terms, seeing it as the result of Ottoman male initiatives, quote, in evidence of the constant increase of Occidental influences in Turkey, a considerable number of young Turkish women were permitted to exhibit their paintings at an exhibition. I wanted to emphasize the word permit. Furthermore, when the Ottoman state decided to commission a series of modern war-related works in 1917 for an international art exhibition and provided artists with material and financial support in the famous Şişli Atölyesi, no woman artists seem to have participated in the workshop. Also, no woman seemed to have reviewed any art exhibitions between 1914 and 1918, and no woman took part in art juries. The contemporary male reviewers did not ignore the fact that women artists contributed to these exhibitions. They did not, however, discuss any individual work by a woman artist. When, and even if, a woman was praised, she was praised because she could paint like a man, which was used as a handsome compliment. This gender stereotyping, no doubt, was everywhere. The French document I showed previously and sent by the Louvre authorities to Halil Edem reveals that Mihri was praised artistically because she could paint like a man. Now, let me move on to the third question I raised in the beginning of my talk. What did Mihri paint, and what could have been the reasons behind her choices of subjects and the way she painted them? As Özlem has pointed out, throughout her long artistic life, Mihri used her social status to establish a network among the cultural and political elites, and she benefited from those relations artistically as a portrait artist. Mihri was one of the most technically accomplished portraitists of her time, producing vivid and richly colored portraits of individuals both within and beyond her elite circle. Among the portraits Mihri executed was Tevfik Fikret, the prominent Ottoman poet. This is one of the photos from our exhibition showing Tevfik Fikret's sentiments about Mihri as narrated by a fellow intellectual, Ruşen Eşref. There is a woman upstairs who is painting my portraits. If you know how beautifully she reads and recites my rubab, I cannot help but think what impressive things I have written. She truly makes me understand myself better, end quote. Tevfik Fikret was not only impressed by Mihri's literary skills, but certainly also by her portraiture. Ruşen Eşref continues to relate his conversation with Tevfik about Mihri's artistry. Among them, quote, among them was a portrait he loved most of all, and Tevfik is talking now. Look how beautiful this is, showing my head so wonderfully, a head that narrows towards my nose like that, and if my nose were any longer, I should resemble an elephant, end quote. Most likely caused from the corpse of the poet, his death mask of Tevfik Fikret needs further attention, as it is Mihri's only three-dimensional work we know of so far. As we can read in a memoir published by Tevfik Fikret's friend Rıza Tevfik Bölükbaşı, who was present at poet's death, Mihri also asked if she could make a plaster cast of his right hand and even asked for the shirt Tevfik Fikret wore on his deathbed, promising to keep it as a precious memento. Having produced Tevfik Fikret's wife permission, the woman's shirt was cut, the poet's shirt was cut off him with scissors and given to Mihri. Mihri mostly worked on commission, including on portraits she produced of the family of Mustafa Asım Turgut, the Ottoman Minister of Foreign Affairs, or of Naile Hanım, mother of Ahmet Rıza, the politician and prominent young Turk. Mihri truly excelled in her skill at working in pastels, as can be seen here in her portraits of children. Throughout her life, Mihri never became a mother, but she became popular for her portraits of children, like this one of Münis Faik, son of Faik Ali, the poet and the governor of Kütahya, as well as the son of Mustafa Asım, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The most arresting of these portraits are the artistically and brightly lit faces of these children, with their radiant smiles and perhaps executed in a rather kitsch way, in contrast to her more realist portraits of adults. I assume that Mihri commanded some handsome prices among her many commissions. Mihri also persuaded her family members to sit for her, including her sister Enise Hanım, whom she drew with pastels. In contrast to rigid academic tradition, which is usually represented with oil paints, a medium Mihri adopted for some of her commissions, as we saw like for Naile Hanım's portrait, pastel is a dry medium and was ideal for Mihri to express spontaneity, delicacy, and sincerity. Here we can see the harmony of complementary colors in Enise Hanım's pink and cream flesh tones, the black color of her hair, as well as the details of her dress, the vibrant blue background on the right side, and the bright green and purple details of her dress and the blue undertones of her skin. Whilst Mihri characteristically creates a naturalistic representation of her sitters' faces by blending the colors, she often leaves areas of her composition unfinished. In her sister's portrait, we can see the areas left untouched at the corners of the paper, especially at the bottom, as well as the gaps between the spontaneous and energetic strokes of color in the frame of her dress. This style is in a sharp contrast to conventional pastel practices, where color pigments are carefully blended and smudged and fill the entire paper. To my knowledge, there are no recordings about her views of the contemporary art Mihri surely saw during her stay in Europe, most especially in Paris. Yet throughout her career, she continued producing figurative work in a style with gestures in its margins at the stylistic developments in modern art in Europe. I must say that this copy of the painting we showed in our exhibition reveals the colors in a better light. So painting intimate portraits of people in her friend circles or beyond, Mihri perceptively and unambiguously captures the personality of her sitters. In the self-portrait I have already shown, Mihri manages to convey her own facial expression with great success. Her young self, represented at bust length, is clothed in an almost semi-transparent décolleté dress with a black ribbon. The fashionable hairstyle, combined with a bright golden color headband or a tiara, are clearly daring and casual. Whilst the entire composition is exaggerated by simultaneous and uncontrolled strokes, Mihri's direct gaze and confident, optimistic smile captures the essence of her agency and presence. Some of those paintings, most especially of women from lower classes, are characteristic of her close studies of human faces, reminding us of her early work as a copyist, Frans Hals, the Gypsy Girl. Her portraits of women are strong in character, rendering homage to women's agency and feminine qualities, rather than portraying them merely as decorative and consumable objects, as we see, for example, in the Orientalist painting of Osman Hamdi on the right side. An Ottoman art critic wrote about her portraits in the following words, quote, "Mihri Hanım is certainly a highly gifted portrait painter. Although the same strength is apparent in all her works, one must admit that it's her portraits of women that are most to be valued, though her lines be as gutsy and her colors as pellucid as ever. For the femininity of woman finds in the works of this esteemed artist a further proof, indeed a tribute," end quote. Mihri painted a few still lifes, but she seems to have showed little interest in painting plein air landscapes. From one Ottoman reviewer who visited her solo exhibition in 1918, we learned that she only displayed a single landscape painting, to the disappointment of the reviewer, which was rather small. But why was this the case? feminist scholars have written about the gender segregation of leisure. Cultural activities in the public arena, from sports to sitting in cafes, were a masculine domain. Men had the liberty to move in the street, whereas women's leisure was restricted to the home. Indeed, as in other contemporary contexts, most Ottoman women artists who produced or exhibited work seem to have limited their subject matter to still lifes, or as we see in the case of Mihri, to portraits. Limited access to the public sphere restricted the area of experience as well as the representation of this experience. And to remember what Mihri said in her 1919 interview, this social structure, this way of life, deprived women of artists of many things. A comparison to the works by 3 Ottoman male artists from the period will make my point clearer. This painting by Ibrahim Çağlı shows pretty young Ottoman woman freely enjoying a stroll outside in modern clothes, a popular theme which no Ottoman woman artist seems to have produced. Mihri, like her other female colleagues, was working in an environment where the feminine was identified as an object for the male gaze and women were represented as Wendy Shaw has emphasized as, quote, cultural symptoms more than as agents of social change, end quote. In a similar vein, for Ahu Ansman, quote, this apparently feminine but actually masculine protagonist of the modernization experience ground itself not in the experiences of women, but rather in the observations of man, end quote. 2 realist painters from the late Ottoman period, Simon Agopyan and Garabet Nishanyan, who depicted the lives of the lower classes in the street, will make the point clearer. Through my conversations with my dear friend and colleague Vasken Davidian, who focuses on realist painting in the late Ottoman Empire, I can safely claim that we don't really know a female equivalent of Agopyan or Nishanyan. Pastel seems to have been Mihri's favorite medium, a preference she maintained throughout her artistic life. Pastel was for a long time largely undervalued as a medium for painters, but it also did not require the use of a studio and hence was preferable in practical terms for women artists working at home. As I have discussed, depicting scenes of modern life outside the street was not an easy business for a woman artist. There were exceptions, to be sure, such as the extraordinary landscapes created by the Greek painter Talia Flora Karavia, who was an active participant of Istanbul exhibitions in the early 20th century and who had her own studio in Istanbul. Here we see Talia in her Istanbul studio. In her autobiography, Talia Flora Karavia writes about her plein air experience in Istanbul. Quote, outside my room atelier, unforgettable little corner. The boatman is wandering down the paved waterfront and the small boat gently swaying in front of the wet steps. And the paint box, the canvas, and the umbrella waiting for me. I rush to the boat and the paddles in their rhythmic up and down take me to the silky waters and I'm hunting the boats of the fishermen. And then a struggle began to capture with my brushes the airy, smooth colors of the waters and the vibrant ambience, end quote. Flora Karavia is thus one of the exceptions which proves the rule. In fact, as much as the conservative attitudes determine women's positions within the art world, they also shaped women's subject matter in art. Yet, it is also significant to remember Mihri's role as an educator at the Academy of Fine Arts, encouraging her students to leave the 4 walls of their studio and experience painting in the landscape. One of her students at the Academy, now an 83-year-old painter, Nazlı Ecevit, remembers Mihri and her plein air classes with the following words, quote, we learned a lot from Mihri Hanım. I can even say that we got all our education from her. Women were not allowed to go outside alone back then, so they couldn't work on landscapes. Mihri Hanım gave us an opportunity for that too, end quote. I believe any study of Mihri or other women artists in the late Ottoman era should take into account both the prejudices and restrictions women had to confront in their societies and the strategies they chose in accommodating, subverting, and resisting them. Mihri left Istanbul and her academic job in 1923 and lived the rest of her life in a self-imposed exile. We can only speculate about the reasons why Mihri left Turkey and never returned. Mihri retained her Turkish citizenship and seems to have kept her connections with the young Turkish Republic. In addition to giving public talks praising the new republic, in 1921, she sent gifts in boxes to Mustafa Kemal, and we may assume that would have included her artworks. Sometime between 1926 and 27, Mihri also produced an impressive full-length portrait of Mustafa Kemal. The whereabouts of the painting remains unknown today, but as we know from the letters Namık İsmail, the director of the Academy of Fine Arts, wrote to the Ministry of Education in Ankara in 1927, the work was 2 meters tall. Having seen the painting in Rome and highly impressed by it, Namık İsmail adds that, quote, "It was the most successful portrait of Mustafa Kemal has ever been created so far," end quote. I might even claim that this work, now lost, is perhaps the most approachable and friendliest portrait of Mustafa Kemal ever created. Mihri's success as a portrait painter was due to both her technical brilliance, but perhaps more to her characteristic aesthetic understanding of the sitter. Without being fulsome, she did produce flattering portraits, creating an idealized version of the sitter. We can see what I mean perhaps better in this photograph we showed in our exhibition, taken in America, and showing Mihri posing in front of her portrait and next to its subject and patron, the sitter Rountree, Mr. Rountree, clearly appears as a subtly more dashing young man on canvas than in real life. As an artist, Mihri wanted to create works which were loyal to the sitter in front of her, but she also added her own idealized touches. In fact, as we know from the 1919 interview, Mihri was ashamed of her work on one portrait of a British priest because the sitter, Reverend Robert Flew, serving as the minister of the Evangelical Union Church of Pera back then during the Armistice Period, seems to have insisted that he wanted to appear as he really was. Mihri remembers this encounter with the following words while showing her portrait to the journalist. This is Mihri talking about her portrait. Quote, "Look at the face of that priest. You see the ears, the eyes, the nostrils, a roly-poly, offish countenance. The face doesn't suit him at all. And I told him so, but he insisted. So I went ahead and finished the thing, but I'm ashamed to call it my work." End quote. Unfortunately, I don't know where this portrait is today. After spending a few years in various European states, Mihri finally moved in 1927 to the United States, where she very cleverly and successfully promoted herself with the exotic Turkish identity, perhaps even in a self-orientalizing way. As Özlem Gülündaoğlu's impressive research shows us, Mihri continued to produce, exhibit, and educate until she passed away in New York in 1954. And this is in a sharp contrast to how she would be remembered in Turkey as a marginal and radical woman who died and almost, it is implied, deserved to die in poverty and destitute, a myth unsurprisingly created by male writers. Today, her works, though limited in number, can be found in various museums and private collections in Turkey as well as in America. The marginalization of Mihri in art historical discourse is complex, so is her recent reinstatement and high profile in Turkish cultural memory. Mihri was never totally invisible in Turkey, but like most Ottoman woman artists, she remained relegated to rare footnotes if she was lucky. In 1924, When Halil Ethem published the catalog of the painting collection he had spent 13 years compiling, and which also included the copy Mihri created in 1911 by Franz Hals, Mihri was remembered by Halil Ethem with the following words, quote, "Turkish ladies have a marvelous talent in the art of painting. Among them, the painter Mihri Hanım, the first mistress of the Academy of Fine Arts and trained in Rome and Paris, must surely be memorialized as one of our great artists." Mihri's achievements as an art educator and her remarkable talent in the art of painting should have indeed ensured her a place among the great artists, but her legacy was marginalized by a history produced by and privileging Turkish men. After 1923, the history of Turkish art became the story of the Turkish man associated with the birth of Republican art, the stories of the group now known as the Turkish Impressionists or the 1914 generation, including Çallı İbrahim, Avni Lifiş, Ruhi, Namık İsmail, and so on. Unsurprisingly, all men now became an inseparable part of modern Turkish art history writing and the collections of museums. These are the covers of the monographs of these male artists published in the 90s. In the 1980s, Mihri was blatantly granted a place in a survey of Turkish women artists written by Taha Toros and entitled Our First Woman Painters. Even in this survey, however, as in the rest of the biographies in the book, her art production was overshadowed by details of her so-called marginal and radical life, or at first by her father and husband's fame. Unfortunately, she still is sometimes remembered in Turkey as Mihri Müşfik, forced to carry the name of the first husband's name she married in 1911 in Paris and divorced around 1923. Today, we know a good deal more about Mihri because recent studies carried out by women scholars have shown us how remarkable a woman Mihri was, both as an artist and educator. I would like to name some of these valuable sources, such as the 2007 biographical study written by Mahiner Tuna, the 2013 article Burcu Pelvanoğlu wrote in English for the edited volume, A Social History of Late Ottoman Women, and the 2017 doctoral dissertation Özlem Gül'ün submitted in Montreal. I should also acknowledge the forthcoming projects dedicated to Mihri, including the documentary film Who's Mihri, directed by Berna Gençak, and finally Özlem's forthcoming book and catalog. I can say that 2019 marked a moment of popularity for Mihri. Together with the Salt Galata exhibition, there were journal issues dedicated to her, including Milliyet Sanat, and the special issue of Toplumsal Tarih that Özlem and I co-edited, contributed also by two women scholars, Fatma Ürekli and Ahu Antman. I must also acknowledge that Mihri's work has become quite popular in the Turkish art market, and it's quite remarkable that some of the works attributed to her are surely not by her at all. I'm aware that to say an artwork is not by a specific artist is a big claim because spotting forgeries might require more than an expert eye, because, it also requires provenance research and scientific analysis of the canvas. But seeing mediocre watercolors in the art market sold under Mihri names, when the works clearly carry the Ottoman signature of a male artist, Refet Başokçu, one cannot help but think that perhaps Mihri is quite unique in that her value in the market is considerably more than that of some of her male colleagues. Here I would like to thank Erwin Cemil Şık for looking at those works in the art market with me. I strongly believe that exploring Mihri, who was once in the front lines of the Istanbul art world, together with her highly accomplished artworks and active role in women's art education, will allow us to explore many issues related to women's agency and empowerment, but also the limits within the social and cultural structures which promote the dominance of women by men, both in the art world and in art history writing. It is significant to add that inequalities or divisions, gender or otherwise, do not occur in a void in social life, nor do cultural institutions and practices simply reflect these hierarchies without resistance. These very institutions could be, and in fact, were also changed and transformed by the actions of the same people who suffered from their inequalities. In fact, one of the aims of this paper has been to prove that a woman like Mihri managed to find a way to move beyond her appointed social destiny and became an agent of social change. There remains, however, so many more stories of women artists to be uncovered and reassessed in Turkish art history. I would like to finish by adapting a phrase from, of all people, George Orwell. I will say that in Turkish art history, Ottoman women artists are invisible, but some women are more invisible than others. As I have previously claimed elsewhere, canon formation and cultural memory in Turkey have been deeply marked not only by a male-dominated narrative, but also a nationalist one, which have crowded out both women and non-Muslim artists. As such, if we would like to write a more inclusive, democratic history, we should also go beyond our Muslim and Turkish focus and try to understand what Armenian, Jewish, and Greek women, to remember Mihri, were also deprived of. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gizem. That was a wonderful lecture. People who have questions for Gizem, or they may have questions for Ahmet after hearing his remarks, can put those in the Q&A box rather than the chat, as I mentioned earlier. Can I ask if Ahmet Ersoy would like to come back to us? Here we are. And I'm going to pass to him now for his comments on the lecture. Thanks again.
Thank you. I would like to first thank the British Institute at Ankara for making me a part of this wonderful event. And it's a real pleasure to be commenting on such a fascinating presentation. So thank you, Gizem. And I think this is, I mean, it's a brilliant, very nuanced insight into the life and career of an artist who had long been relegated to the extreme margins of the Turkish art historical canon. And as you suggest, I think it's important to also to emphasize that Mihri Rasim was a figure, an artistic figure who was doubly marginalized. She was not only ailed by the structural sexism that is deeply embedded in the Turkish art historical canon, that has only recently been challenged by contemporary scholars, but she's also ailed by a persistent Eurocentric biases and priorities of a broader field of study, women's art. So I think the talk was important, not only because it offers us a very incisive, very textured account of Mihri Rasim's particular works, individual works, taking into consideration the artist's thematic, stylistic, technomaterial choices as well as constraints. But also, I think the talk, your talk stands as an admirable effort to historicize, to rigorously, surgically historicize the career and personality of Mihri Rasim with recourse to archival sources, with recourse to narrative accounts, first-person accounts that you have so successfully integrated into your presentation. And I think you very astutely, you contextualize Mihri Hanım's rise to prominence within the Turkish late Ottoman, rather artistic milieu with particular reference to the changing dynamics of Ottoman culture and Ottoman society under the rule of the Young Turks and during the tumultuous years of the First World War. And it's very important, I think, that you call into attention not only the dominant practices of gender segregation that were at hand in the late Ottoman period, but also you point out to the opportunities that arose within this very turbulent period that have actually shaped Mihri Rasim's career choices and stylistic inclinations. By opportunities, I mean, for instance, the point that you indicated, the decline in male labor, decline in male presence in the artistic scene during the war years. And finally, I think it's very important that you emphasize, and we cannot really emphasize this enough, I think, the discrepancies, the absences, the sins of omission that are lodged within the Turkish art historical canon as regards the position and role of women artists, but also as regards the presence and the impact of non-Muslim artists. And I think it's very important that you kind of couple these two forms of absences. And I think in this sense, Mihri Rasim is a peculiar case because the little that she stands out in art historical writing has to do not with her career as an artist, but it has to do with her, and not it does not have to do with her artistic persona, but with her individual personality, or assumed and partly fabricated personality as a woman artist who is portrayed as this, bohemian, eccentric, libertine kind of woman standing on the margins of established social norms with, almost overt insinuations of promiscuity and excessive freedom. And this, of course, in striking contrast to eccentricity that is defined as a positive attribute when it comes to the portrayal of male genius in both romantic and modernist kind of forms of writing artistry. And I think Mihri Hanım was acutely aware of these asymmetries, of these restrictions, as indicated in the quote that you used at the very beginning of your talk, where she's talking about being deprived, very, very openly so. And I thought that, now I'm slowly coming to my questions, I thought that deprivation was a good concept, good point of departure for formulating my question, my first question, which is more of a methodology question, if you will. So I'm curious to hear more about how you felt deprived. In what ways did you feel restricted or challenged in the process of conducting research on a hitherto misrepresented, underrepresented, marginalized artist, in terms of accessing your sources, interrogating these very sources? What were the practical methodological challenges in working on such an artist? You can, I think in the case of Mihri, we're lucky that we have recent, very meticulous studies like Özlem's work and also Burcu Pelbanoğlu's work. So you can take the question as more collectively in terms of both your own work and also your collective effort with Özlem. How do you deal with this methodologically, and what are the challenges? And finally, a broader question that has to do with historiography of art history. So the question is something like this: in what way can stories of female artists like Mihri Rasim, or you can think about it as a broader category, non-Muslims, all marginalized artists, in what way can these recent studies, alternative kind of revisionist studies, help us challenge, subvert, reformulate the established paradigm of Turkish art history? How do you think these studies will contribute to the reshaping of the paradigm? Or more particularly, I can say maybe, how can we move beyond an add and stir kind of approach where we're just adding more names, more marginalized names, but nevertheless the paradigm itself remains. And finally, I promise, just in connection to this historiography question, how do you cope with the challenge posed by the biography genre in the writing of art history, the life of the artists kind of approach with all of its embedded norms, established kind of patterns of thought? Yani, as you know, biography is tightly intertwined with the male dominant mode of structuring art historical narratives, the artist and his works kind of approach I'm talking about. So how can we work on a biography and yet undo this configuration of the artist and his works? So this is a question that is annexed to the previous one. I know that it's a viciously broad question that kind of deserves a comprehensive manifesto of some sort. So obviously you can take it in any way you like. You can approach it from any angle you like. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. And thank you again.
Oh, thank you, Ahmet. These were excellent questions, and thank you for a very kind summary. So, I mean, coming to your first question, what was I deprived of, or what were the problems I faced while writing this paper, or while looking at Mihri? I would say a lack of her works. I mean, we do have a number of limited works by her, and I try to show them. But in order to understand her development throughout her career, we need to have more artworks. And I'm really interested. I mean, it would be great if we can compare her early works to the later ones. And I think, I know from Özlem that she's at the moment working on a catalog, and I believe this will provide us a better tool to analyze her development as an artist. So I would say that was the first thing that I struggle with. I want to see more works by her to understand, but we have a limited number of works. And we know that from the interview, most of her works were burned in fire in Fatih, so during the First World War. So I mean, we also, these works don't exist. The ones that some of them that she had produced in the Ottoman Empire, and most especially the portrait of the peasant woman that I show, which I had from Büyük Mecma. I would love to see the original work, but we don't know where it is. Or the British priest that she was kind of mocking. It would be fantastic to understand what she means by his silly face. But as much as I honestly, if I had written this paper before 2019, before our exhibition, I wouldn't have that much sources. So I think our exhibition we collaboratively organize for the first time reveal many primary documents that was either about Mihri or that Mihri herself kind of provided to us. So in a way, I believe in collaborative work, and the exhibition gave us this platform that, I mean, I learned a lot from Islam. I learned a lot from our exhibition material. And I can say honestly that I'm very lucky that I was part of it. So thank you for inviting me to the museum committee. So, I mean, to summarize, I think collaborative work, we can learn a lot from each other. And the second question is, so in what way you say, like these stories, recent stories about Mihri or other women can contribute to Turkish studies? Definitely. I mean, as I showed in my presentation, these kind of monographs of men published in the 90s, we don't have any monographs of any woman artist. I mean, we have to have more. I'm not saying it's not a problematic way of approaching woman art or woman artists to publish monographs, but at least we don't even have that. And I believe these recent studies, like Özlem study, like Burcu Pelbenoğlu's, or more theoretical works like Ahu Antman, will definitely contribute to our understanding of the gender hierarchies, as well as to know more women from the Ottoman past, more women artists from the Ottoman past. But obviously it is it's the first step, and I will come to that, what I mean. And you know, your third question is the biography genre. In a way, it's kind of a masculine domain to produce a biography. But I would like to emphasize that there's a difference between a biography of a woman artist and a feminist biography of a woman artist. So just a biography of a woman artist, just maybe look at her life. But a feminist biography requires more than that. So in addition to her life, it will record what, you know, how she functioned in the art world that she functioned, what were the reasons behind her choices for subject matter, and what were the difficulties she faced that her male colleagues didn't face, like a few questions. So there is a difference between how we write biography of a woman artist than writing a feminist biography of a woman artist. And I believe one of the problems about biographies of women artists is that they don't really look at the artworks. It's just limited to their lives. And most of the time it's very tragic life, you know, kind of also limited around the man around them. Like, and Mihri is a good example, you know, Mihri, you know, tragically died in America. She was poor. It was all, you know, kind of, they wanted to kill her because she was a bohemian woman, but that was not the case. We have to go beyond, and we have to look at the artworks themselves and to engage with it really critically, analytically. Yeah, I think, I hope I answered your questions, but I mean, I think we're receiving questions, but I think what can we do from now on, it's kind of replying to your second and third question coming together, is that I mean, I would like to emphasize 3 points. First of all, definitely we have to study more women. Like, you know, as like one of my earliest slides were about the 70s hidden heritage kind of movement, you know, we have to find more women from history. But while doing that, we shouldn't only focus on Turkish Muslim women, and there were more. But while doing, you know, while finding a non-Muslim Turkish woman, Armenian, Greek women, we shouldn't also kind of try to create an idealized, romantic, cosmopolitan Ottoman world. We should honestly talk about what these women faced. And I mean, another thing is that we should look at the artworks, really engage with it and do it theoretically. And as I say, I think, and we should do that. We shouldn't stuck with the, you know, like 19th century or early 20th century, we should also come to contemporary art. We should also try to understand contemporary women artists. And this is my third point, in a way. And I believe, like, I would like to say two names, Ahu Antman and Ceylan Özpınar, in the way that they really deal with contemporary artists, look at them and understand them with really like feminist analytical tools. So I hope I managed to answer.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I also have a question, but I'm going to restrain myself and read some of the questions from the audience. There are several now. So Edward Asquith writes, excellent. Was Mihri way ahead in her talents and skills compared with other female artists of her time? Or were there others of her equal or close to her success? I mean, something that I noticed was the first, all of these titles calling her the first woman artist. I mean, it kind of brings to mind that the way that those works about her life have been titled.
I mean, she was not the only one. The problem that she became the first Turkish painter because the secondary literature that was not interested in non-Muslims. I mean, there were many women before Mihri who joined the exhibitions in Istanbul, for instance, in the 19th century. And thanks to Seza Sinan Uslu's work, we know that we can see many women's work. And I think Talia Flora Karavia, in a way, she's an excellent painter, and I think I also find it very problematic to try to find the very first, who was the very first. And it's very like, I mean, if you're not interested in present, you're not interested in the first. Like, it very much affects how you look at it. So I wouldn't call her the very first Turkish artist, the very first kind of artist who was that much talented. There were many more, I mean, yeah, that's but she was amazing. She was a remarkable and talented artist. I cannot deny that. I hope I answered that question. Yeah. Or was it a question about modernism, which I was not sure.
Well, I think the main question was whether she was so unique or whether there were other women artists at the time who were producing equally talented work.
Yeah, there were other women who were producing remarkable works. But what was unique about her, she had the opportunity to become the director of the school. One question might come, could she become the director of the school if she were not a Muslim or coming from an elite class, is another question. Yeah, but there were more women as remarkable as her. But Mihri is also very talented. Yeah.
So another question is, this one is from Umut Parmaksız, our colleague at the Institute.
Hey,
he writes, do we know if Mihri had any contact with the women's rights movement while she was in Europe?
Yes, thank you, Umut. I mean, through Özlem's work, we know she involved in like League of Women's Voters in America, and she was active. Again, this is Özlem's research, that she was quite active in women's rights in America.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question. This is from Priyanka Chakraborty from Kolkata. She writes, I would like to ask that, will it be okay to say that Mihri was an artist as well as a feminist within her art in her contemporary time? And then it goes on. And also some contemporary female artists and female writers like Frida Kahlo, Virginia Woolf also showed their lead with their art. So can we say that Mihri was also one of them?
Yeah, what is a feminist art? I mean, I've been thinking about that too. Like when we look at Mihri, can we say it's a feminist art? Obviously, she was, and I try to say in my paper that she painted women differently than her male colleagues, and you can see that in the way that the way she painted them, gave them agency. They're not to. I mean, Mihri's women are not there to please male gaze. They have they have agency, and she was really good at reflecting that too. But in what way? I mean, feminist art as a term is quite like post 70s term, and it's mostly used for contemporary artists. So I don't want to sound like, oh yes, hers was a feminist art, and we can have all the reasons to say that she was involved in women's movement. You know, the way she paints is definitely different from her male colleagues. But the question whether we can just label it as a feminist art, that I'm not sure. It's a good discussion about, you know, it's a good discussion topic.
Yeah,
I don't know if Ahmet would like to add something.
I think you wrapped it up very well.
I'm going to ask.
There are so many other questions. I'm hesitant to talk. So
let's see if we can get through them all before. Gizem, just be careful of touching your microphone on your headphones.
Oh, sorry.
Getting some interference when it knocks against things. So this is a question from YouTube that Charlotte's copied over. It's from E. Göktürk Kılcan. They write, is the reason why there was no avant-garde art like France and Russia in the Ottoman Empire because of the lack of public space, as Habermas said?
I mean, there's a one way to understand civil society in the Ottoman Empire. If you know, civil society versus the state, the Ottoman Empire will be a different case. It's not like Europe, but civil society did exist. And I would say the thing is, we always assume there was no avant-garde art in the Ottoman Empire, but there was. I mean, there was the Armenians were publishing and translating, for instance, futurist futurist poems as early as 1913. But it mostly remained in Armenian literature circles, avant-garde, rather than in visual culture. So I think I don't want to be too critical, but I would like to bring the issue that, in fact, these categories, avant-garde, modernist, figurative versus modernist painting, this kind of limits our discussion. That's why I try to kind of break that. I mean, you can't say Mihri was following avant-garde styles, but she was very aware of it. And recent feminist studies shows us that there were many women from the late 19th and early 20th century who were producing modern figurative art, which was later kind of marginalized by this post-Cubist artistry writing, which kind of praise male avant-garde artists. So I think the way we think about avant-garde is kind of, I always think, oh my God, this is the New York school, and anything not avant-garde is not welcome, it's not worth talking. So you know, one answer is that yes, there was avant-garde Armenian literature group who was interested in futurism, but at the same time the visual culture didn't have the avant-garde that Europe had. But doesn't mean that they were not interested in modern style. I think we should separate from modernist and modern style. Yeah, I don't know if it answered, if I managed to answer your question.
Well, again, it's another big topic.
Yeah, exactly. But thank you for asking.
Next question, Sarper Yilmaz writes, I wonder her professional life in Europe, especially as a portrait painter. I recently encountered a note in the Sabancı Museum mentioning her life in Paris and in her life from portrait painting. Do we have any information pertaining to that stage of her life?
You mean in Paris?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, Özlem will be the best person to ask, but as I showed in my paper, that she did receive an honorable mention. And she also kind of, I mean, was establishing her relations with the Ottoman Empire while in Paris. But as I say, we don't have, as far as I know, Özlem might know better, that we don't have any records of what Mihri thought about the art world in Paris. This is one of the other things that I was deprived of. You know, I would love to hear what Mihri thought about the contemporary art world that she was part of in Europe. Yeah.
Okay. Next question is from Saria Akan. They write, thank you for the great talk, Gizem. Were there non-Muslim women students in the Fine Arts School for Women, which Mihri directed? Were non-Muslim women artists suffering some similar limitations in their own communities? I remember that you briefly mentioned the artist Eleni, cannot recall her last name, and her experience, but I'm wondering if you encounter anything more about this. And it follows, how was the relationship between Muslim and non-Muslim artists? Did they support each other? Thank you again, Gizem, Ahmet Hoca, and organizers.
Thank you for this question. Yes, I mean, from the archival materials that I found, we had many non-Muslim names. I shouldn't say many, maybe. We had a few non-Muslim names, especially Armenian woman's name in the fine arts school. And most of them I tried to track what they did. I couldn't find much information about them, but we do see names. And the question between non-Muslims and Muslims, this is the other thing that I'm really interested in. I mean, they of course they knew each other. They went to the school with, they exhibited together. And for instance, I mean, I will give the example from a male painter. Sorry to kind of give the example from a male painter, but the Armenian artist like Panos Tarlemezyan, when he wrote his memoirs in Armenia in the 30s, late 30s and 40s, he writes about his Muslim painter friends. Like he says, Ibrahim Çallı, Namık İsmail, I really love them, but then the imperial war came and kind of broke everything. So they, I think it depends how these relations were remembered after 1923. We don't, one of the things I struggle as a historian is this silence that, you can't hear a silence, but this is the silence that you don't hear about those relations between the Muslims and non-Muslims from Muslim artists who kind of survived, who stayed with the Turkish Republic. But thank you. And so they were friends. Quick answer, yes, of course, they knew each other well.
Yeah, it's also something I've encountered. I mean, the problem of writing anything about late Ottoman Istanbul is that so much of the population ends up elsewhere, that the methodological challenges of finding those students who maybe ended up living the rest of their life in Selanik or Athens.
Yeah. But networks are interesting, and we do have sources. Like when you look at contemporary reviews published in, for instance, Armenian newspapers, they give the names of artists who visit their exhibitions, like Abdülmecit Efendi, all these, as I say, Namık İsmail. I mean, you can read those names. So they really visited those. They knew each other, as I say. But it's such a cosmopolitan city. So as you say, it's not very easy to follow these networks.
Also, maybe, Yani, it's important to note that the Academy of Fine Arts was one of the few official institutions of higher learning that was openly cross-communal. I mean, people from, unlike military schools or engineering schools that were established by the state, these institutions were open to people from all ethno-linguistic, ethno-religious communities. So there was even this kind of structural seedbed within which these people could form these networks.
Definitely. I mean, precisely for instance, we know from the Academy of Fine Arts for Men, opened in 1883. The first graduates, as my dear friend Vasken Davidian shows us, like there were names like Simona Gopyan was one of them, Fetvetyan was one of them. You can see that, as you say, Ahmet, I mean, this is really like multicultural institutions, different also from the military schools, definitely.
There's a few more questions from the audience. Berna Genschalp writes.
Hey, Berna.
Okay, she says, thank you for the presentation. I wonder if Mihri were friends with her contemporary women painters in Istanbul and in Europe and the US. This needs to be researched as well.
I totally agree. I mean, for US, it's Özlem. I wish she were here. I wish she could talk. But I mean, in Istanbul, the thing is, as I say, Mihri did not display in group exhibitions. Like, she did not participate in Galatasaray exhibitions. She only displayed her works in her own flat. And as I couldn't I mean, I have not yet been able to find her connection with another female colleague. I mean, we know there was Aznif Hanım in
Your microphone was switching. Yeah.
Oh, set up.
It's
Can
okay.
you hear?
Yeah, we hear you now. It was you. I think you were pressing it against the book or something. It was buzzing, but it's not.
Apologies.
It's back to normal. Yeah.
Okay, let me turn this just in case. I mean, Zoom always has this technical problem, and I must confess I felt really strange talking to myself for like 50 minutes. Anyway, yeah, I mean, we know Aznif Hanım, that she was also another instructor in the Academy of Fine Arts, and I'm sure they had some connections. But it's a great question. I mean, in terms of like this artist networks. Thank you, Berna, and thanks for joining.
Neriman Ozer writes quite a lot of a long comment, which I won't read everything of, but she agrees with you about the importance of Mihri Hanım. She asks how the pastel works fared so long a time as opposed to oil paintings regarding durability against the damages of time. And she also asks whether she asks a similar question to the previous one about the level of Mihri's interactions with artists abroad in Europe and America.
I mean, pastel, as long as there's no damp, you know, no humidity, is one of the most resilient actually art form. Oil paints can crack, and we see one of the paintings I show, actually a woman portrait that Mihri created in oil. It's kind of a few cracks on them. So pastel can be, you know, can resist the time. So it was also another practical reason some artists prefer that. And the connections that kind of the same question that Berna had already asked. Definitely, I think we should look at more artist networks around Mihri. Yeah. I think I can see the questions as well. Yeah.
I know we don't have that much time left. I'll try and squeeze one or two more in, if that's okay with everyone. Karima Senyuchel asks, why did she go into exile after the 1920s? Since she had a rich family and aristocratic background, why did she end up in poverty, buried in the cemetery of poor people? She painted the portrait, etc. in the US.
First of all, actually, as Özlem proves, she didn't really die in destitute. She had, she had a studio in a very great place in New York. She continued producing portraits, working as an educator in a school. You know, she really, it's a kind of myth that was created after. And the question that why she left is definitely a fascinating one, but one can only speculate, as I say. One reason that is possible is, you know, or a bit reasonable, is that Mihri had connections with Young Turks and the CUP, you know, Hüseyin Cahit, Şükrü Bey, the Minister of Education, and he was hanged in 1926. You know, I'm not sure how Mihri felt about that, and she might have felt threatened about it, because in fact she kind of moves to New York in 1920, so she comes and goes back, but. I think, but at the same time, she continues to support the Turkish Republic with her talks. As I say, she sent gifts to Mustafa Kemal. I think it's a fascinating historical question, but one can only speculate, I believe. But it's an exciting speculation, definitely.
It's 8:30. There are a few questions unanswered, but I think if you'd like, we can stop here, and people can direct those to you by email.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So
thank you very much, by the way, for joining.
You're welcome to write to Gizem any questions that went unanswered. I'm sorry, we have a limit on time. today. Yeah, I would like to thank Gizem for a wonderful lecture, and also for being a great colleague for the last couple of years, and she's been at the Institute longer than I have, in a sense. She'll be moving on soon and focusing on Ottu. So it's great to see that she'll still be in Ankara and teaching. And also thanks to Ahmet Ersoy for his very useful commentary on the talk. And thanks to everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As you'll have seen in the chat, we have a very lively series of lectures online. It may be, fingers crossed, that we can have some real life lectures again in Ankara, but we're quite committed to keeping the online component so that our vastly expanded audience of the last year or so of online lectures can stay with us. So yeah, please have a look at the website and sign up to the mailing list if you haven't yet, to be informed about future events organized by the British Institute and our colleagues. Okay, thanks then. I'm going to close the lecture now.